So over to you.
Okay, thanks. Yes, in the title of this meeting, we have the slogan, "Delist the PKK." That is from the list of banned terrorist organizations. The Belgian court has undermined the terrorist stigma on any party to an armed conflict, such as the PKK. And when Jan said another approach is possible, I mean, that has analogies or echoes from the slogan from the counter-globalization movement in the late 1990s, "Another world is possible." And then we had spin-offs, another agriculture is possible. Perhaps another law is possible as well. And in fact, it already exists in international humanitarian law, so perhaps the question is whether nations, states that signed up to international law will apply that clause of international law. But we need to ask the opposite. That is, why have so many armed groups, parties to an armed conflict, been stigmatized as terrorists? And why the PKK in particular? If we want to overcome the ban, that is to remove the PKK from that list, then we need to understand its basis. So let's look back to the late 1990s, because its political legacy will continue with us until our collective action undermines that legacy. We go back to the Prevention of Terrorism Act 1974, whose main role was to terrorize Irish people, to turn people into informers, to make them frightened of each other and of state authorities, to frighten them into silence and submission. But when the war in Northern Ireland was subsiding in the late 90s, there were hopes that the 1974 Act would lapse, it wouldn't be renewed, as it had to be every year as supposedly temporary emergency powers. But instead, those powers were expanded and made permanent in the Terrorism Act 2000. Now why? Remember, this is before 9/11, before anyone had any idea that such a thing as 9/11 could happen. So to understand why, well, in the 1990s, movements for national self-determination or national liberation movements were gaining transnational public support amongst the migrant communities who had fled from oppressive regimes to Western countries and amongst wider political forces in those countries. So this was seen as a problem for those governments. UK government advisors identified such ideological support as a significant problem. And we had the self-styled expert on terrorism, Paul Wilkinson, an academic, writing a report for the government, 1999. He said, "A terrorist group looks internationally for any ideological, political, or diplomatic support it can manage to obtain. Sub-state terrorism," by which he meant parties to armed conflict, he didn't use that phrase, right? Sub-state terrorism is typically the weapon of the weak. We can't have the weak gaining access to any weapon for their cause, can we? So, to remedy this political problem, the UK needed permanent anti-terror legislation defining terrorism in a broad way, according to his expert advice, which was enthusiastically taken up by the new Labour government. Now, his report didn't say why merely ideological support was a problem, though obviously this support could complicate alliances between Western governments and oppressive regimes, especially in the presence of migrant groups from those regimes initiating protests. So for this reason, the state has portrayed national liberation struggles as new existential threats, as if we were, say, facing an invasion from Nazi Germany, similar kinds of emergency powers, except now permanent. So for this political agenda, the ordinary criminal law, even, say, the broad conspiracy law, which has a long history, something, would not suffice. Exceptional powers would be necessary. Hence, the Terrorism Act 2000 defined terrorism to include simply the threat of serious damage to property in ways to be designed to influence the government, that is, any government, for a political cause. If you think about that definition, it could apply to almost all political protests going back centuries. This broad definition blurs any distinction between targets, say between military target, political target, or ordinary civilian targets. Organizations could be banned on the basis that their activities anywhere in the world fit that broad, vague definition of terrorism. And on that basis, predictably, in 2001, the Home Office banned initially 21 organizations, including the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, Tamil Tigers, LTTE, Hamas, and many others. Now, of course, the target wasn't those organizations, which don't exist here anyway. That's why the Terrorism Act 2000 also criminalized any association with such banned organizations. Association defined in a very broad way, including simply wearing a T-shirt or attending a public event which had a speaker from such an organization, and so on. A long list of possible associations, which I'll spare you. But the point is that by creating these new crimes of association, the Act directed suspicion and intimidation at entire communities. And these powers have targeted Muslim and migrant communities which have fled from oppressive regimes allied with the UK. So, in this way, their state terrorism is sanitized by stigmatizing any resistance as terrorism. In so doing, these powers also attack the right of self-determination, as well as popular support for that right across countries. Now, just to give you one example of the powers, many people, tens of thousands of people every year, have been subjected to arbitrary harassment during international travel. Because under the Terrorism Act 2000, Schedule 7 authorizes severe powers at ports of entry, where police can detain, question, and search anyone for up to 9 hours originally, now reduced to 6, at those ports. Refusal to answer even one question becomes a terrorist offense. Detainees are often asked questions about political activities or about just mundane personal details of their lives, even those details which are already well known to MI5 from their wider surveillance activities. In fact, the questions also have prompts indicating that the questioner or someone back in MI5 already knows the answers to the questions. So the purpose is obviously just to harass and humiliate people, also to do so at a time when they are vulnerable to missing their flight or connections, which is why the special powers exist for ports of entry. Not because the people may be dangerous, because the state may be dangerous to your travel, and also to blackmail people to become informers, which has a long history going back to the Irish branch in the 19th century. And Kurdish activists in particular have been routinely questioned under detention at ports. That's just one example of the special powers. But more generally, the bans deter campaigns against oppressive regimes abroad, solidarity with resistance to such regimes, and even deters any discussion about how to resolve the conflicts in dialogue with the people who are being targeted by these powers. So in this way, the regimes abroad more easily continue and intensify their repression of civilian populations by associating them with terrorism, by reference to the laws of the Western democracy. So through this collusion, UK anti-terror powers serve as an instrument of foreign policy, and their application often changes from time to time according to the changes in foreign policy. Now, as we've seen with the Tamils in particular, that's another story for another meeting. So these powers create a wide range of terror suspects and entire suspect communities, a phrase that comes from Paddy Hildyard's book about how the Irish are treated under the 74 Prevention of Terrorism Act. Now, how have Kurds responded to these special powers? When the UK banned the PKK in early 2001, Kurdish groups mobilized 6,000 demonstrators to protest against all the bans, all those powers to ban organizations. Many of the protesters wore T-shirts saying, "I am PKK," thus defying the police to arrest them. Now, there's a clear violation of ban on association with the banned terrorist group. None of them were arrested at the time, because the police were disoriented, of course. But 2 years later, some were arrested. That was a trial in 2003, when some Kurdish activists were prosecuted for supposedly raising funds for the PKK. One defendant was invited by MI5 to become an informer in return for perhaps dropping the prosecution and for some help in gaining refugee status. He refused the blackmail proposal and instead went public. In the case, after the jury heard about Turkey's oppression of the Kurds from many witnesses, all the defendants were acquitted. More generally, Kurdish organizations have faced systematic intimidation from the police. Community centers have been insulted for displaying pictures of a terrorist, in other words, the PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan, who has been imprisoned in Turkey's Imani Islands since he was abducted in 1999, collusion of many states, including the USA. The police have attempted to prevent free expression at Kurdish demonstrations, for example, by suppressing the Kurdish flags or pictures of Öcalan. Police have used the public order laws on the pretext that such symbols would incite public disorder. Kurds have been especially targeted by such powers, as well as Tamils to some extent. Nevertheless, community organizations persisted in their protest. They organized legal observers with help from the Haldane Society, and they warned the authorities of what might be the consequences if Kurds were prohibited from protesting, turning the tables on the authorities. When Kurds persisted in flying this flag, under threat of arrest, the state eventually backed down in practice. No one has been prosecuted for flying the flag. So, in effect, the Kurdish activists in the whole community have acted as if there were no ban, thus undermining it. In parallel with greater UK harassment of Kurds, in around 2010, Turkey escalated its detention of anyone supporting Kurdish demands for democratic freedoms. Detentions soon reached 10,000, half the global total of all people in the world detained under anti-terror powers. So that tells you something about Turkey's anti-terror powers. Detainees were put on trial en masse in 2012, and after Turkey's counter-coup last year, the anti-terror detention expanded on an even greater scale. This was possible only by identifying all the people being arrested long before the coup. In response, UK solidarity activists and lawyers have served as observers in the court proceedings there. They've reported back at public events in London and rightly linked Turkey's terror campaign against its people, and the Kurds in particular, with its UK counterpart actions under counter-terror powers here. Under the ban, anti-terror powers authorized many punishments without trial, such as detentions at ports, many kinds of harassment. They stigmatized the Kurds as a suspect community. Nevertheless, Kurdish activists and their supporters have persisted in protesting against Turkey's state terrorism. And this defiance has gone global. In the Bundestag, members of Die Linke have worn PKK T-shirts to defy Germany's ban, which was the earliest one in Europe. Since Rojava's victory against ISIS, the YPG's experiment in democratic confederalism has attracted people from all ethnic origins there. leading to the formation of the Syrian Democratic Front, creating a new model of community self-rule. Kurdish solidarity campaigns worldwide have held events supporting that experiment, along with Öcalan's writings, expressing a common political project between the YPG and PKK, despite laws criminalizing any association with the PKK. Okay. After the Syrian Democratic Front completed the liberation of Raqqa, the celebration displayed an enormous banner with Öcalan's image. This could be clearly seen on your television screens, but was not mentioned by the newscasters. Why? Perhaps this indicates that the rise in support for that political project has become a political embarrassment, to be ignored rather than to be demonized. Amongst many people around Europe, the terrorist stigma on the PKK is increasingly seen as bizarre or absurd, as well as unjust. All of this matters for delisting the PKK. If we look back in history, unjust laws have generally remained in force until they are contested, defied, ridiculed, and then made unenforceable. So in parallel with our mass petition, the outcome depends on these solidarity actions, which undermine the authority of the ban. Persistence is resistance. Defy the ban.
Thank you very much. And our final speaker is Alistair Lyon.